The murder-suicide witnessed by Floyd Mayweather is a documented history of severe domestic violence and media exploitation. In 2014, rapper Earl Hayes initiated a live FaceTime call with the boxer, declaring his intent to kill his wife, dancer Stephanie Moseley. Leaving the call active, Hayes executed her with over 10 gunshots before committing suicide. Tabloid media immediately shifted focus away from the homicide, utilizing unverified infidelity rumors to explicitly blame the deceased victim for her own murder. This is the cold physical reality of domestic violence and media manipulation. The architecture of modern celebrity often relies on the illusion of absolute security. In the sprawling, sun-drenched metropolis of Los Angeles, this illusion is monetized and heavily guarded behind wrought iron gates, security checkpoints, and the manicured facades of exclusive residential complexes. The Palazzo East, situated in the affluent core of the city, was designed to be one such fortress. It was a highly sought-after sanctuary for young Hollywood elites, successful athletes, and rising artists who desired to live shielded from the unpredictable chaos of the public eye. The building offered a curated existence, characterized by quiet courtyards, subterranean parking, and thick sound-dampening walls intended to keep the outside world firmly at bay. But the fundamental flaw in building an impenetrable fortress is that while it successfully keeps external threats out, it is equally effective at trapping internal horrors entirely within. The morning of December the 8th, 2014, began with the serene, predictable rhythm expected in a luxury enclave. The California dawn cast a pale, early light over the complex, and the residents were engaging in the quiet routines of the early hour. However, at approximately 7:30 in the morning, the heavy engineered silence of the Palazzo East was violently shattered. Shattering any illusion of a mechanical failure or civic alarm, the disruption originated exclusively from the piercing, unmistakable sound of a woman crying out in profound visceral terror. The scream tore through the thick walls of the high-end apartments, instantly paralyzing those who heard it. Before anyone could process the nature of the distress, the scream was abruptly drowned out by a deafening percussive sequence. A rapid succession of sharp concussive blasts, estimated by terrified neighbors to be anywhere from 10 to 12 distinct impacts, echoed violently down the residential corridors. The sounds possessed the heavy metallic resonance of a high-caliber mechanism discharging in a tightly enclosed space. Then, as suddenly as the chaos had erupted, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the complex, a quiet far more terrifying than the noise that had preceded it. The response from local law enforcement was immediate and heavily escalated. The nature of the emergency calls, which flooded the local dispatch center with frantic reports of a barricaded individual and active lethal discharges, required the deployment of the city's specialized tactical unit. Heavily armored SWAT personnel descended upon the Palazzo East, transforming the manicured hallways of the luxury complex into a highly pressurized staging ground. The tactical operators moved with deliberate, silent precision, establishing a secure perimeter and systematically evacuating the adjacent units. The objective was to neutralize any active threat and secure the occupants of the specific apartment from which the devastating sounds had emanated. However, upon reaching the primary residence, the tactical unit encountered an immediate and profound physical obstacle. The apartment was entirely silent, and the heavy front entry was secured. Upon breaching the outer threshold and conducting a rapid, methodical sweep of the primary living areas, the operators found the spaces undisturbed. The tension funneled entirely toward the master bedroom suite situated at the rear of the floor plan. The door to this specific room was heavily reinforced and securely locked from the inside. There was no response to verbal commands, no movement detected from within, and no indication that anyone intended to open the barrier. Recognizing the immediate necessity for intervention, the tactical team initiated a physical breach. The process required significant, sustained physical force, utilizing heavy breaching tools to shatter the locking mechanism and force the heavy wooden frame inward. When the door finally gave way, splintering under the tactical assault, the operators rushed into the enclosed space, weapons drawn, anticipating a dynamic confrontation. Instead of an active threat, they stepped into a static, devastating tableau. The atmosphere within the room was heavy, carrying the sharp, unmistakable, acrid scent of discharged propellants. On the floor of the confined space, the operators discovered two individuals who had sustained catastrophic, irreversible trauma. The medical response was rendered entirely obsolete the moment the room was breached. Both lives had been definitively extinguished prior to the authorities ever crossing the threshold. The tactical operators slowly lowered their weapons, the adrenaline of the breach giving way to the cold, clinical reality of a massive crime scene. The room was immediately cordoned off, and the physical parameters of the investigation were rigidly established. It was in these initial moments of securing the scene that the investigators realized they were facing one of the most complex and psychologically disturbing scenarios in forensic science: a perfect locked room incident. Because the heavy bedroom door had been definitively secured from the inside, and the complex's architecture offered no alternative points of egress from that specific room, the possibility of a third-party intruder was entirely, scientifically eliminated. No one had forced their way into the apartment, committed the act, and vanished into the Los Angeles morning. The absolute physical containment of the space dictated a chilling reality. The perpetrator and the victim were both entirely confined within those four walls. Far removed from the chaotic streets of the city, the true lethal threat had been sleeping directly in the same bed. This architectural reality forced the investigative team to pivot their entire methodology. They could not look outward for a suspect. They had to look inward, relying entirely on the microscopic physical remnants left behind to construct a narrative of the final, desperate minutes. However, as the crime scene technicians began their preliminary visual sweep of the sealed environment, a profound and troubling discrepancy immediately emerged, complicating the initial narrative. The foundation of any forensic investigation is the precise reconciliation between human testimony and physical evidence. The emergency dispatch logs were filled with witness accounts from adjacent apartments, with multiple independent sources explicitly reporting a sustained rapid volley of 10 to 12 distinct acoustic impacts. The human ear, especially in moments of extreme panic, is highly sensitive to the terrifying rhythm of such events. Yet, as the technicians began to meticulously catalog the physical evidence scattered across the flooring of the bedroom and the adjoining master bathroom, the initial count of the metallic casings, the physical footprint left behind by the weapon's mechanism, did not immediately align with the sheer volume of the auditory reports. This critical inconsistency presented the investigators with a complex forensic puzzle. In a locked room where no external variables can interfere, Every single physical element must possess a perfectly logical, scientifically sound explanation. If the witnesses heard a dozen impacts, but the immediate visual evidence suggested a different numerical reality, it meant that the sequence of events inside that sealed room was far more chaotic, convoluted, and terrifying than a simple, straightforward altercation. It indicated that the final moments were not a brief flash of violence, but a sustained multi-stage escalation. The investigation immediately shifted focus. The forensic team had to analyze not just the physical trajectories of the room, but the deeply fractured psychological architecture of the two people locked inside it. They had to look past the wealth and the luxury to uncover a foundation built on profound, fatal insecurity. Bypassing any sudden, unpredictable explosion of rage, the fundamental architecture of this tragedy relied entirely on a slow, methodical campaign of psychological subjugation. Examining the stark, irreconcilable contrast between their professional trajectories perfectly dissects the specific mechanics of this coercive control. Stephanie Moseley did not merely exist adjacent to fame. She was a highly calibrated elite engine driving the global entertainment industry. Earning and maintaining a position as a primary dancer for artists of the magnitude of Beyoncé, Rihanna, and Chris Brown requires an agonizing level of physical discipline, an unshakable work ethic, and an absolute, uncompromising command of one's own space and body. She was a woman who had fought relentlessly to secure her position on the world's most demanding stages, subsequently transitioning her immense physical talents into a successful acting career on network television. Stephanie was fundamentally independent, universally respected by her peers, and entirely in control of her own financial and professional destiny. Conversely, Earl Hayes occupied a profoundly different, deeply frustrating stratosphere within the highly competitive Los Angeles hierarchy. He held the official title of a recording artist, but his operational reality was defined entirely by his proximity to a vastly more powerful entity. Hayes was a peripheral fixture within the money team, the sprawling, opulent entourage surrounding the undefeated boxing champion Floyd Mayweather. Operating within an entourage presents a unique psychological hazard. It allows an individual to bask in the blinding reflection of immense wealth and global fame without ever actually generating it themselves. Hayes had access to private jets, exclusive venues, and high-stakes environments, but he remained a passenger in someone else's empire. He was a man whose public identity and financial stability were entirely tethered to the continued goodwill of a much more successful associate. For an individual harboring deep-seated narcissistic traits, this constant state of dependency breeds a silent, toxic resentment. In a functional dynamic, a partner's meteoric rise is celebrated as a shared triumph. However, in the fiercely competitive, ego-driven ecosystem of the entertainment industry, Stephanie's escalating success functioned as a massive daily indictment of Hayes' own professional stagnation. Every time she packed a suitcase for a global stadium tour, every time her phone rang with a high-profile booking, and every time she received public adulation, it struck a devastating blow to his highly fragile, narcissistic architecture. He was fundamentally incapable of processing her achievements with pride. Instead, he viewed her financial autonomy and professional independence not as assets to their union, but as active hostile threats to his perceived masculine authority. His ego, starving for validation in the recording studio, sought absolute domination within the confines of his own home. Unable to dictate his own career trajectory, Hayes aggressively pivoted his focus toward controlling his wife. He initiated a systematic, exhausting campaign to dismantle her autonomy. The luxury apartment at the Palazzo East was slowly stripped of its function as a sanctuary and converted into a highly monitored, heavily regulated psychological prison. He instituted relentless interrogations regarding her daily schedule. Every professional interaction, every late-night choreography rehearsal, and every male colleague was aggressively scrutinized. Hayes weaponized her working environment, baselessly framing standard industry networking and collaborative rehearsals as definitive evidence of infidelity. This behavior is a clinical textbook manifestation of severe coercive control. The primary objective of an abuser in this dynamic is to completely exhaust the victim. By manufacturing intense volatile conflict around every external interaction, the abuser makes the simple act of maintaining outside friendships or professional networks so psychologically draining that the victim voluntarily severs those ties just to secure a brief moment of peace. Hayes actively transformed the choreographers, the directors, and the artists Stephanie worked with from supportive colleagues into perceived adversaries. He created an environment where Stephanie was perpetually forced to defend her integrity, walking on eggshells to manage his highly volatile, unpredictable emotional state. At the absolute center of this abuse was a terrifying, deeply entrenched ideology of ownership. For a narcissist facing complete professional irrelevance, the possession of a highly desirable, universally admired partner becomes their primary source of identity and status. Hayes's internal logic operated on a chilling, binary premise: absolute, unquestioned possession or total scorched earth destruction. The concept of "if I cannot have you, no one else will" is frequently dangerously romanticized in popular culture as an expression of overwhelming passion or deep tragic love. In reality, it is the ultimate expression of human objectification. It entirely strips the victim of their agency, reducing a human being to a piece of property that must be violently destroyed rather than allowed to exist independently. Despite the suffocating weight of this environment, Stephanie possessed the immense internal strength required to recognize the escalating toxicity of her reality. Understanding the severe danger of his unyielding control, she successfully initiated a physical separation. She moved out of the shared residence, breaking the immediate chain of daily surveillance and attempting to reclaim her physical safety and psychological clarity. She established a boundary, distancing herself from the relentless accusations and the volatile mood swings that had consumed her daily life. However, the cycle of domestic abuse is rarely broken by a single, definitive exit. The most statistically dangerous period for any victim is the immediate aftermath of establishing independence, as the abuser recognizes the absolute collapse of their control. Facing the loss of his primary asset and the ultimate blow to his ego, Hayes deployed a highly calculated manipulative strategy to reel her back in. Instead of utilizing overt threats of physical violence to orchestrate her return, he aggressively deployed the far more insidious weapon of false contrition. Just days before the fatal encounter on December 8th, he flooded her with desperate, tearful apologies. He made sweeping promises of profound personal change, coupled with intense declarations of his commitment to repairing their fractured union. He actively manipulated her empathy, exploiting her fundamental decency and her residual hope for the man she had married. He utilized the tactic known as hoovering, sucking the victim back into the chaotic cycle through a temporary manufactured display of vulnerability. Stephanie was drawn back to the Palazzo East not out of weakness, but under the tragic, carefully constructed illusion that the man who had systematically dismantled her freedom was finally capable of rehabilitation. She agreed to meet with him, stepping back across the threshold of the luxury complex to negotiate the terms of their relationship. This calculated deception placed her directly back inside the heavily reinforced walls of the master bedroom, entirely isolated with a man whose failing ego demanded an ultimate, permanent assertion of dominance. He had successfully lured his target back into the cage, setting the stage for a technological and physical escalation that would leave no survivors. The boundaries of a locked room are absolute in the physical world, but in the modern era, true isolation is nearly impossible. Even as Earl Hayes secured the heavy door of the master bedroom, sealing himself and Stephanie Moseley inside a soundproofed vault of his own making, a digital conduit remained wide open. In the frantic, escalating moments preceding the fatal gunfire, Hayes did not reach for his phone to contact emergency services, nor did he call a family member seeking intervention. Driven by a collapsing psyche and a desperate need for validation, he initiated a FaceTime call to Floyd Mayweather. A forensic analysis of the profound psychological deficit driving the perpetrator perfectly exposes the architecture of this specific digital interaction. In the hierarchy of Hayes' reality, Mayweather was not merely a friend or an associate. He represented the absolute zenith of masculine power, financial invulnerability, and untouchable status. As Hayes' own perceived authority was crumbling within his marriage, he felt a compulsory, deeply disturbed need to perform his final act of dominance for an audience that embodied the success he could never achieve. The call was a grotesque attempt to justify his impending violence, seeking an impossible vindication from a figure of ultimate authority before he crossed a line from which he could never return. When Hayes bypassed emergency services and initiated a FaceTime transmission to Floyd Mayweather, he engineered an unprecedented asymmetrical trauma dynamic. He effectively transformed the highest paid, most physically dominant athlete on the planet into a helpless digital hostage. For Floyd Mayweather, an individual whose entire existence, immense wealth, and global empire were built upon the absolute mathematical control of physical violence within a highly regulated 20-foot boxing ring, the reality of that FaceTime call was a catastrophic psychological inversion. Inside the ring, Mayweather possessed absolute agency. He dictated the pace, anticipated the strikes, and neutralized threats with unparalleled biomechanical precision. However, when the screen of his mobile device illuminated on the morning of December 8th, 2014, that lifelong illusion of absolute control was instantaneously, violently shattered. Through the digital compression of the cellular network, Mayweather was forced to stare into the frantic, severely degraded psychological reality of his protege. Stripped of any genuine desire for counsel or a financial bailout, he weaponized the video application exclusively as a macabre theater E, broadcasting his homicidal unraveling to the alpha of his social hierarchy. According to subsequent law enforcement leaks and insider accounts of the digital exchange, Hayes was operating in a state of blinding, hyper-paranoid agitation. He aggressively vented his baseless, toxic delusions regarding Stephanie Moseley's alleged infidelity, frantically attempting to litigate his bruised ego to a billionaire audience. He explicitly announced his intention to execute his wife, presenting his impending violence not as a crime, but as a twisted, necessary reclamation of his masculine honor. This placed Mayweather in a horrifying, inescapable paradox. He was a man accustomed to fixing any problem by throwing massive amounts of liquid capital or highly trained security personnel at it. Yet, looking through the glass of his smartphone, separated by miles of Los Angeles traffic, his billions of dollars were rendered entirely scientifically useless. There was no private jet fast enough, no armored SUV heavy enough, and no bodyguard lethal enough to cross the physical distance and breach the locked door of the Palazzo East before the hammer of the gun dropped. The psychological agony of that specific realization, the absolute impotence of supreme wealth, is staggering. Mayweather, recognizing the lethal trajectory of the rant, desperately attempted to execute verbal de-escalation. He pleaded with the frantic man on the screen, attempting to utilize his status as the undisputed leader of the money team, to command Hayes to stand down, to reconsider, to step away from the edge of the abyss. But logic cannot penetrate a mind that has already structurally collapsed into homicidal narcissism. Completely abandoning the role of a subordinate seeking advice, he operated strictly as a predator, demanding a witness for his final, gruesome act of control. The exact moment the physical escalation began, the visual geometry of the FaceTime broadcast shifted. The mobile device was abruptly set down on the bathroom counter, its camera lens capturing only static, arbitrary angles of the ceiling or the tiled walls, while the microphone remained wide open. Mayweather was forcefully transitioned from a visual spectator to a captive auditory hostage. He was forced to listen, in real-time, high-definition audio, to the brutal, mechanical execution of a human being. He heard the frantic, desperate pleas of Stephanie Moseley echoing off the bathroom tiles. He heard the heavy percussive detonation of the high-caliber firearm discharging multiple times in a confined space. He heard the chaotic, violent acoustic footprint of a woman being slaughtered, followed by the sickening final discharge as Hayes turned the weapon upon himself. And then he was forced to listen to the absolute suffocating silence of a room that now contained two corpses. The digital connection remained open, tethering a living billionaire to a slaughterhouse, forcing him to absorb the raw, unfiltered audio of an extinction-level domestic event. The immediate aftermath of this digital witnessing forced a massive, highly complex collision between a homicide investigation and a global corporate brand. The Los Angeles Police Department's Robbery Homicide Division instantly identified Floyd Mayweather not as a suspect, but as the primary indispensable material witness to a murder-suicide. This categorization triggered an immediate high-stakes deployment of corporate damage control. The Money Team, TMT brand, is a meticulously curated empire, built entirely on the aesthetics of untouchable luxury, invincibility, and success. Being intimately, digitally linked to a squalid, horrific domestic murder threatened to introduce a highly toxic, uncontrollable variable into that lucrative brand architecture. When detectives formally requested to interview Mayweather to reconstruct the timeline and establish Hayes' exact state of mind, the corporate shield was instantly activated. The interaction was heavily insulated by elite legal counsel and high-powered public relations executives. The objective of Mayweather's camp was to carefully navigate the legal obligations of a homicide investigation while aggressively distancing the champion from the radioactive fallout of the crime. The public statements issued were strategically brief, expressing standard condolences but remaining legally sterile regarding the specifics of the FaceTime call. The corporate machinery recognized that while the trauma inflicted upon Mayweather as a captive listener was undoubtedly genuine and severe, acknowledging the gruesome details of the digital execution could permanently stain his marketability. The forensic reality of that FaceTime call serves as a chilling, permanent indictment of the modern digital era. It stripped away the physical boundaries of violence, proving that cellular technology can instantly drag an unwilling observer directly into the center of a bloodbath. For Floyd Mayweather, the event was a brutal, unvarnished lesson in the absolute limitations of human power. He was forced to confront the terrifying reality that all the championship belts, all the global adulation, and all the offshore bank accounts in the world could not purchase a pause button. He was forced to stand behind a glowing screen, entirely paralyzed, while a man he considered a brother systematically destroyed 2 lives, leaving the undefeated champion with a digital memory that no amount of money could ever successfully erase. While the visual components of that FaceTime call were chaotic and fleeting, the audio data it transmitted served as an incorruptible digital witness to the tragedy. In modern forensic investigations, a captured audio file is not merely a recording of voices. It is a complex, 3-dimensional acoustic landscape waiting to be mapped. When law enforcement and technical analysts acquired the digital footprint of those final minutes, they subjected the audio to rigorous frequency analysis. This scientific process strips away the superficial noise, breaking the sound waves down into isolated measurable frequencies. Through this acoustic dissection, investigators could establish a highly precise millisecond by millisecond timeline of the escalation. The human voice, particularly when expressing profound terror, registers at specific identifiable frequencies. The audio captured the final desperate verbal exchanges, mapping the exact moment the confrontation transitioned from a heated argument into a lethal threat. More importantly, the digital footprint recorded the environmental acoustics. Analysts examine the latency and the specific reverberation, the echo of the captured audio. The sound waves bouncing off hard, tiled surfaces possess a distinctly different acoustic signature than waves absorbed by heavy bedroom carpeting or drapery. By analyzing this echo, technicians determined that the mobile device was abruptly set down on a hard surface within the master bathroom. This acoustic triangulation placed Hayes' exact physical location in the critical seconds before the violence commenced. The most chilling revelations extracted from the digital file, however, were the microscopic mechanical sounds buried beneath the vocal chaos. Advanced audio filters isolated the distinct metallic friction of a high-caliber firearm being manipulated. The digital witness captured the precise sequence of the weapon's operation, the racking of the slide, the chambering of the ammunition, and the heavy mechanical click of the safety mechanism being disengaged. These tiny isolated acoustic spikes proved undeniable intent. This was not a weapon that discharged accidentally during a physical struggle. The audio forensic data proved it was a weapon being methodically, purposefully prepared for execution while the phone rested on the bathroom counter. When the digital analysis reached its limits, the physical science of the crime scene took over. inside the confined, shattered space of the master bathroom, forensic technicians face the grim task of letting the physics of the environment speak for the victim. Without a living eyewitness, the trajectory of the ballistics became the primary, unassailable narrator of Stephanie Moseley's final moments. Mapping a ballistic trajectory in a close-quarters environment requires absolute geometric precision. Technicians utilize physical dowels and high-intensity lasers, threading them through the entry and exit points of the structural damage, the shattered mirrors, the punctured drywall, and the ruined cabinetry. By extending these lines backward, the lasers intersect, revealing the exact point of origin for every single discharged round. This process effectively reconstructs the physical posture of both the shooter and the victim at the precise fraction of a second each trigger pull occurred. The laser grid established in the Palazzo East bathroom revealed a harrowing narrative of absolute confinement. The trajectories did not indicate a static confrontation. They mapped a desperate, frantic struggle for survival within a space offering zero avenues of escape. The angles of the impacts demonstrated Stephanie's terrifying realization of the threat and her ultimate futile attempts to find physical cover behind the meager architecture of the bathroom fixtures. The overlapping laser lines created a visual dead zone, definitively proving that Hayes had methodically tracked her movements within the enclosed space, discharging the weapon multiple times to ensure catastrophic, lethal trauma. To completely eliminate any residual theories of a simultaneous struggle or a tragic, chaotic accident, investigators turned to the highly complex discipline of fluid dynamics, specifically the analysis of blood spatter patterns. When a high-velocity projectile strikes a human body, it does not merely cause structural damage, it atomizes the surrounding fluids, creating a microscopic aerosolized mist that travels outward from the impact zone at specific angles and speeds. By analyzing the distribution, the size, and the elliptical shape of these high-velocity droplets across the tiled walls, forensic experts can determine the exact proximity of the weapon to the target and the angle of the strike. The patterns in the bathroom indicated close-range, direct impacts, entirely consistent with a deliberate execution rather than a wild, untargeted discharge during a physical wrestling match. However, the most profound and definitive physical evidence left in the room came in the form of void patterns. In forensic science, a void pattern is an area of negative space. It occurs when an object, a piece of furniture, or a human body intercepts the high-velocity mist, leaving a clean, blank silhouette on an otherwise coated surface. These empty spaces are the ghosts of the crime scene. By measuring the geometry of these blank spaces on the bathroom walls and doors, investigators successfully placed the ghosts back into the room. The void patterns proved exactly where Stephanie was positioned when the trauma was inflicted, and crucially, they proved where Hayes was standing in relation to her. The sequence of these overlapping patterns completely dismantled the narrative of a chaotic accident. The physics of the fluid dynamics proved beyond any shadow of a reasonable doubt that Stephanie Moseley was incapacitated and executed first. The subsequent, distinctly different pattern generated by the final gunshot confirmed that Hayes, having completed his horrific objective, then turned the weapon upon himself, utilizing the final round to permanently escape the legal and moral consequences of his absolute need for control. While the forensic technicians inside the Palazzo East methodically documented the cold, irrefutable physics of the crime scene, a completely different, highly destructive apparatus, mobilized outside the heavily guarded gates of the complex. The digital landscape of the entertainment media does not operate on the slow, meticulous timeline of the scientific method. It operates on the immediate, voracious demand for sensationalism. Before the official police barricades were even fully established, the machinery of the modern tabloid press had already begun to heavily commodify the tragedy. The physical violence within the master bedroom had ceased, but a second, deeply insidious assault was rapidly initiated against the victim's character. The immediate media response, spearheaded by aggressive digital outlets like TMZ, fundamentally bypassed the severe systemic issue of domestic control that had actually caused the tragedy. A factual reporting of coercive isolation, narcissistic rage, and intimate partner violence does not generate the massive internet traffic required to sustain the tabloid economy. To maximize engagement, the press actively mutated the narrative of a brutal execution into a salacious, easily consumable celebrity scandal. They required a compelling, scandalous motive, and they found their mechanism by aggressively injecting unverified rumors of infidelity into the public discourse. The tabloids latched onto a deeply damaging, unsubstantiated narrative involving R&B singer Trey Songz, attempting to construct a classic, highly profitable love triangle trope. Articles and online broadcasts actively shifted the focus away from Earl Hayes' documented history of extreme jealousy and psychological manipulation. Instead, they weaponized Stephanie Moseley's private life, heavily implying that her alleged indiscretions were the direct catalyst for the fatal event. The headlines were meticulously crafted to prioritize the rumor of the affair over the reality of the murder. This is a highly calculated editorial strategy designed to manipulate public perception, subtly suggesting to the audience that a victim's personal choices can serve as a logical, albeit tragic, justification for a perpetrator's lethal rage. This media strategy executes a profound, devastating form of victim blaming. It operates on a deeply ingrained, toxic societal bias that seeks to hold women accountable for the violence inflicted upon them by men. By framing the narrative around Stephanie's alleged infidelity, the tabloids successfully transformed the perpetrator from a calculating, controlling abuser into a temporarily insane, heartbroken husband driven to the edge by a betrayal. It is a grotesque inversion of reality. It completely ignores the clinical fact that domestic violence is never the result of a victim's actions. It is exclusively the result of an abuser's absolute, uncompromising demand for control. No professional interaction, no text message, and no alleged affair ever justifies the deliberate discharging of a high-caliber weapon into a human being. The tabloids utilize Stephanie Moseley as a highly profitable human shield for their own legal and financial protection. Because Earl Hayes had taken his own life, he could never be indicted, he could never stand trial, and he could never be cross-examined regarding his motives. The legal system was entirely bypassed. Furthermore, because the dead cannot sue for defamation of character, the press possessed absolute legal immunity to dissect, fabricate, and publish whatever narrative generated the most revenue. The media functioned as digital vultures descending upon the tragedy to harvest the remaining value of Stephanie's celebrity. They subjected a woman who had just suffered a catastrophic, terrifying end to a highly public post-mortem character assassination, allowing the global audience to act as a jury in a trial where the defense could never speak. The official response from the Los Angeles Police Department offered no public defense of her honor. Once the forensic analysis conclusively proved the sequence of events, that Hayes had executed his wife before turning the weapon upon himself, the criminal investigation reached its administrative conclusion. The case was formally designated as a closed exceptional clearance. In law enforcement terminology, this classification means that the police possess overwhelming, undeniable evidence identifying the perpetrator, but physical circumstances completely prevent the suspect from being formally arrested, charged, and prosecuted. The legal file was shut, sealed within the archives of the precinct. There would be no high-profile trial, no presentation of evidence before a judge, and no public reading of a guilty verdict. The justice system washed its hands of the tragedy, leaving the media's fabricated narrative as the loudest voice in the room. Yet a closed legal file does not dictate the final legacy of the event. The ultimate defense against the tabloid machine was not found in public relations statements, but in the sterile, objective data collected by the crime scene technicians. The laser grids, the acoustic frequency charts, and the fluid dynamic patterns of the blood spatter do not possess biases. They do not care about celebrity rumors, and they cannot be manipulated to sell magazine subscriptions. The scientist operated as Stephanie Moseley's final unassailable defense attorney. The data definitively proved the reality of a trapped, terrified woman attempting to survive the calculated execution orchestrated by a deeply disturbed, narcissistic abuser. The forensic truth entirely stripped away the illusion of a spontaneous crime of passion, revealing the chilling mechanical reality of absolute coercive control. The tragedy that unfolded behind the locked door of the Palazzo East serves as a permanent, deafening warning regarding the insidious nature of domestic isolation. It shatters the pervasive illusion that extreme wealth, global fame, and high-security living environments offer any genuine protection against intimate partner violence. The velvet ropes and the gated communities of the entertainment industry only serve to create more effective, soundproofed environments for abusers to operate within. The warning signs exhibited by Earl Hayes, the relentless interrogation of colleagues, the aggressive monitoring of communications, the manufactured isolation, and the terrifying ultimatum of ownership are not isolated anomalies of celebrity culture. They are the universal foundational blueprints of lethal domestic violence. The public must actively reject the sensationalized narratives that attempt to justify or romanticize this level of psychological domination. Stephanie Moseley was not a casualty of a complicated love story. She was the victim of a man whose failing ego required her total destruction. She was a woman who possessed immense, undeniable talent, a ferocious work ethic, and a brilliant trajectory that was brutally, prematurely severed by an individual completely incapable of matching her light. Her legacy demands that we look beyond the manufactured scandals, that we recognize the fatal architecture of coercive control before the lock turns on the door, and that we fiercely protect the objective truth from the machinery that seeks to bury it. The tragedy at the Palazzo East serves as a permanent warning about the insidious nature of coercive control. It shatters the illusion that extreme wealth and gated communities offer protection against intimate partner violence. Instead of confronting his own professional failures, Earl Hayes chose the ultimate cowardly assertion of control. He ended his own life to slam the door on the justice system, ensuring he would never face a courtroom. But objective truth requires that the narrative be wrested away from the perpetrator. Stephanie Moseley was not a casualty of a complicated love story, nor a victim defined by tabloid rumors. Her true legacy is written in the flawless execution of her art under blinding stage lights and the fierce independence she built through sheer willpower. Her brilliance stands in permanent defiance of the darkness that attempted to consume it.